Hello, Alan.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you for asking. Alan has been tucked away over there in a small box with his vintage watches, antiques, vintage kind of ephemera and bits and bobs. Why don't you start, Alan, by introducing yourself a little bit and explaining where you come from and what you've been doing?
Hello, Austin. Woo! Yes, thank you. I wanted to be like a rock star. It's my only chance. My name is Alan Bedwell. I am an Englishman. I've been living in New York for 16 years. I'm an antique dealer primarily, and I moved to New York to work for Ralph Lauren. And my first job for Ralph Lauren in London was buying and selling all the beautiful vintage objects that you would see in the stores across the European stores. And then they moved me to New York. I got a job in design. And then I was frankly broke. So I was trying to figure out a way to make a little bit of extra money. And I got a great opportunity to curate some vintage pieces for the Bergdorf Goodman department store in New York. It was kind of a side project to start with while I was still working, and then it kind of became big enough where I had to make a choice between staying at Ralph or, going to do this full time. And I thought, okay, you know what, I've done enough time working for big companies, I'll try and be an entrepreneur. So here I am, and the rest, as I say, is history, really.
Okay, so let's get into the weeds then. Let's talk about building up a vintage watch collection. The trends come and go, and it seems like all of a sudden there's more of one type of watch and then there's none of another. What would be your first tip for somebody who either is getting into watches or has a kind of a collection at the moment but wants to elevate the level of what they're holding?
I mean, honestly, I think, and it really is important, I think you've got to buy what you like. Like, don't be dictated to by trends. Don't be dictated to what certain publications are pushing. Go out there, try things on, expand your horizons, and don't just try and stick to the obvious brands. Find things that really resonate with you, whether it's the way a dial's designed or whether the way a handset's made, the case shape has chamfers and edges that you're like, oh wow, those are fantastic. Because some people love 70s design, and there's an amazing amount of beautiful 70s watches that, if that's your thing, will look amazing on your wrist and you'll love it. But it's not a Rolex.
There's a very well-trodden path to vintage watches, which seems to start and finish with a Rolex Submariner.
Yeah, totally. And I'm not gonna by any means disparage the Rolex Submariner. I own a couple.
Great watches, yeah.
I'm a fan of the Submariner, but don't let it always be an obvious choice that's what you have to go and buy. I just think it's a brilliant piece of utilitarian design. It's a watch that can do everything for you, so I love it. But, here I am wearing a 1960s small Tudor, and I still love this. So don't just close all the doors and just focus on something like Rolex or Patek. Go and try on a Jaeger LeCoultre, for example, and not a reverse. So go and try on a simple time only.
Because obviously with watches, price is always an indication. You can get wonderful, wonderful watches for a few £100 or 500 or 1,000 or whatever. But it's really important to buy the highest quality you can of a certain thing, isn't it?
If you have a budget to spend, buy the best example of a reference that you like in that budget. Don't buy a really beaten up, bad dial, replaced handset just because you want that reference. Because it's, especially from an investing perspective, in the long run, that's going to kill you. A bad watch is a bad watch. So
right. Let's talk about condition, because that is probably the one leading factor in building a watch collection that has value, both in terms of financial value, but also certainly aesthetic value and probably emotional value.
You have to be a little careful with it because it does mean different things to different people. Some people really covet tropical dials. If you think about it, a tropical dial is a dial that's damaged. If you sent your 5512 to Rolex for service in the 80s and it got water in it and it started to turn brown, they whip the dial out and they put a brand new dial in for you because, sorry, sir or madam, your watch is damaged, we're fixing it for you. Whereas, You know, some people love that. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I think for the most part, condition is very, very, very key. 15 years ago, I used to get watches polished fairly regularly because watches had to be what you call in the business like retail ready, because people didn't want a watch with scratches on it. Whereas today, if you show someone a 70s sub that hasn't got scratches on it and has been polished to crap, they're like, ooh. But that's a very new way of thinking. But it's the right way of thinking. That's why when you find a Rolex sports watch in particular, say from the 70s or 60s, that's not been polished, they go for huge premiums now.
So when we talk about polishing, we're talking about the metal of the case being brought up to a kind of professional shine, but sometimes there's brushed casing and things like that. It's often, you can kind of tell when something's been polished because the edges are soft. But dial maintenance is sometimes harder to spot, right?
You have to really know what you're looking at. Like I said, if you took a Rolex and Rolex put a service dial on the watch, it's still a Rolex dial made by Rolex. So if you don't know what you're looking at, and let's say a 70s Rolex went into Rolex in the 80s, they changed the dial and put the new dial on. If you don't know that that's the right dial, mark dial for that range of serial numbers, then it's not a correct watch. But it may have been done by Rolex, and it's a Rolex dial, but it's not original. So there are many levels. There's refinishing of dials, which is where the dial is stripped and repainted, and then there's replacement dials as well. So you've got, there's lots to put into consideration, which is why, as I say, really original watches command such a great value today.
Across different genres, different rules seem to apply, because in the vintage car world, sometimes an old car that's been refinished, that's been brought up to today's standard, is celebrated and is a beautiful thing and worth millions, but you couldn't do that in a watch world.
No, and it is kind of a weird, perverse mindset, because a lot of watch guys are car guys and car guys are watch guys.
Of course.
So they'll take their 50s Ferrari in to have the body completely stripped and all the filler taken out and panels repatched and welded back together and then brought back to a beautiful, show-ready, Pebble Beach-ready finish. And here they are, proud of their car, which is now worth probably, $7 million, $10 million. But if you did that to a Patek Philippe, you've taken all the value away from the watch. And here you are with this shiny turd, essentially. Almost illogical way of thinking.
It's totally
about
illogical, yeah. It doesn't really make any sense as to why it's okay in one field and not in another.
Yeah, and I think, but that's, in a way, that's kind of what makes watches special, unique, and interesting and compelling. And when you talk about investing in watches, understanding these different things to look out for is absolutely crucial, really.
In the past, watches were historically pretty small, up through the 50s, the 30s, 50s, up to even the kind of 70s and early 80s. Watches, particularly dress watches, were small, 33, 34, 35 mil. And then Sylvester Stallone happened.
The Slytech, yeah.
And Panerai kind of blew up. Big watches were the thing.
Yeah, I mean, all the major brands were essentially panicking and finding ways to make their watches bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Fortunately, we're seeing that come to an end, and we're seeing kind of it's essentially like a cruise liner for the Swiss watch industry. It really is like, a very slow, steady turn. There's never a knee-jerk reaction, so these things take time. When they did the OPs, for example, Rolex, in all the colors, they didn't just do them all in 40, 41. They did, they did the 36 and they did the 40.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because in style, in tailoring, fit is so important. You're told all the time about wearing the right proportions, all this kind of thing. Whereas you can see quite dainty people, male and female, with blooming great enormous watches, and it looks incongruous.
I think there's not much worse for a guy's style when he's wearing a nice shirt, a good jacket, and his sleeve is 3/4 of the way up his arm because he can't get it over his watch, And you see a lot of that, unfortunately. I mean, I think, as I say, less so now. And, back to your point about your gender, it's really great the article you did with Tyler, the creator, he wears a lot of watches that were essentially made for women back in the day, but they look awesome on him. He looks really cool. That whole, oh, that's a women's watch mindset philosophy is really changing now. And I really like that, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also, it's kind of happening in fashion as well with people like Harry Styles and the kind of the rise of more gender fluid clothing and brands making kind of genderless collections. It's kind of interesting that it's coming along together in that way, but it does seem the watches is still quite a way behind.
Without a doubt. As I say, unfortunately, the watch industry is still, majority driven through Switzerland, and they really move incredibly slowly. I think they're aware, but there's a long process between awareness and then actually for it to come out the finger onto the page with a design brush. It's a very complicated, long drawn out process.
But you're working with one of the youngest female. What would you call her? An influencer? That seems to do her a disservice. But you're working with Bryn Waller, who's Dime Piece on Instagram.
Bryn's fantastic. A breath of fresh air. I met her when she was putting this concept together of trying to get more attention for women in watches because it is such a male-dominated world. You only have to look at brands like Rolex. They phased out anything under 30 millimeters. They don't make it anymore. If you're a smaller lady or you're any lady who wants to wear a smaller watch, you have to buy vintage. You can't go into Rolex and buy a brand new version. And that's kind of crazy to her. She gets invited to watch events and the brand's like, oh, Bryn, you've got to see our new women's watch. And it's like 38 millimeters. And she's looking at it like, oh, wow, that's great. But I would never wear that. There's not really any kind of interaction between them. I don't think there's much dialogue that goes on with regard to what do women want today. And it's not even women, as we're talking about now. Like a lot of guys, I sell a lot of watches now to guys who are 20, 28, 29 millimeters. And some of them look better than you can imagine. You're like, oh my God, that looks so cool on you.
Yeah. It's there's definitely a kind of you do you thing that's happening a bit more, which is
totally
great. People
and she's really pushing that agenda, and I think the fact that she's, a shooting star right now actually says a lot to what people are feeling as well. She's touched a nerve, both with regard to size and like women's role in collecting and women's role in watches and watch design. I think it's really important.
So what can you tell us a little bit about how to service watches, how often they need looking after, how you maintain them and keep them safe?
I always use the car analogy when it comes to this because I think it's the easiest way for people to get their heads around it. Because when you look at a watch, as when you look at a car, you don't always think about what's under the bonnet or the hood. You don't really think what's behind the dial. Well, behind the dial on watches are absolutely spectacular works of art, miniature machines. And every machine needs lubrication. And if you don't get the watch serviced, depending on the watch and how often you wear it, let's say at least every 3-5 years, you're really damaging the watch because the lubrication will dry out or it will just evaporate or it'll get sticky if you're not wearing it enough and it'll damage the watch. And so a routine service that you should do, let's say every 3 years, will save you a lot more money in the long run than if you just ignore it for 15 years and then take it in.
So it's not the case that the watch will just stop working. It will actually physically damage the watch and it will...
Yeah, because you've got to think about it. You've got, metal gears moving inside, and if there's no lubrication between the teeth, they're just grinding on each other. So what they're doing is they're wearing themselves away. I get pushback from a lot of people too. It's like, oh my God, how's it $1,000 to service a watch? Well, I always say to those people, go on YouTube and go and watch a watch service. So there's some guys that have dissected watch servicing and they've sped it up. And when you watch that, you're like, oh, that's why it's $1,000. Okay.
Yeah, it's a very long process and it's incredibly laborious and these tiny, tiny little screws and everything. It's a very skilled process, right?
Absolutely, and it's, more often than not, most guys, you have to work in a really hygienic, sealed environment so there's no dust particles and hairs floating in the air. It's a serious thing.
Fantastic. Well, Alan, thank you so much for joining us up here. Thank you for being part of the House of Robb. It's been wonderful to have you.
Thank you, everyone.
Alan Bedwell,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.